Well, thank you for listening and welcome to the latest edition of Ed Talks. And this morning I'm joined by someone who I would like to say occupies, or I would suggest occupies the same sort of space that I used to in the residential space, but on the social housing side of things, and someone that I've been extremely impressed with over the last couple of years. And I will introduce him, James Tickell, who runs a company called Campbell Tickell. Perhaps, James, you'd like to say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, it's a pleasure to be with you, Ed. Campbell Tickell has been around for about 20 years, and we work in housing and a number of other spheres as well. We work on governance, strategy, recruitment. It's a kind of go anywhere, do anything kind of firm. People ring me up when they've got a problem.
So a sort of troubleshooter in the social space.
There is a bit of troubleshooting, but many of our clients are not in trouble.
No, sure, and they want to avoid being in trouble, which is why they come to you in the first place. Okay, so let's dive straight in then, bearing in mind that I would imagine for a number of our regular listeners, the social housing space is something of an area they don't necessarily know a lot about. How would you categorise the social housing sector? What differentiates it, for instance, from the private rented sector?
Well, the social housing sector is much larger than most people realise. There are millions of homes in the social sector. It is not for profit, so it's, in theory at least, values driven, and it is regulated far more intensively than the private sector. There's a social housing regulator who's pretty active. You could compare them to the Charity Commission, I suppose, and they set all sorts of guidelines. They step in when things go wrong. So it is a fairly intensively regulated sector which is social purpose.
Okay, and the challenges that face the people that operate in that sector would be?
Well, I think what's happening at the moment is they've been facing the same challenges as every other business with the pandemic. How to maintain services, how to make sure that repairs get done, that they collect the rents during the pandemic. And just as we were looking forward to the pandemic ending and life getting back to normal, they're beginning to realise that actually the world is changing and not necessarily for the better. So the pandemic was one thing, the knock-on effects of Brexit are another, and of course, perhaps most pressingly at the moment, the terrifying prospect of a war in Europe, but actually the wider implications of that, the disruption to supply chains, the possible global famine that may be upon us, and all of that is compounded by climate change really beginning to accelerate. So they're trying to get their heads around what is going to be a much, much more demanding future, and they're realising that it isn't going to get back to normal.
Because I think a lot of people don't quite recognise that, of course, social housing or social housing providers have a number of different areas of their business. Obviously, there's the business of looking after their tenants that are already in place, but then a lot of them have to conduct commercial sides of their businesses in order to fund the not-for-profit side. So therefore, they're in the business of developing shared ownership properties. How many different areas are there within social housing that need attention? Do you know?
Well, there's quite a range. As you say, Ed, a number of organisations have commercial subsidiaries. I would say, though, that when you say not-for-profit, they do make a surplus. And what is the difference between a surplus and a profit? So they may be not-for-profit, but they have to be run on a business-like basis.
Well, no, I was just going to say that I think a lot of people, if they think about social housing, sort of perhaps have a slightly old-fashioned view of it, that it's sort of buddling along and it's anything but these days, isn't it? It has to be run like any other commercial enterprise. And as you say, using words like surplus instead of profit obviously is the way they communicate that sort of thing, that making a profit. But for them, it is absolutely vital to be doing that. Otherwise, they can't continue.
Well, it is absolutely vital. And you asked actually the different areas. So some of them are involved in kind of community development activities, not necessarily profitable, but supporting tenants and communities. They have one or two have got factories, kind of window factories or prefab factories. Some are in private renting. They rent out to from the private market or sometimes to key workers. Shared ownership is actually a form of social housing in which people buy part of the equity of their homes but remain tenants. So there is a range of activities that they're involved in. I think that for most of them, though, the good old-fashioned rented housing at reduced rents is the mainstay of what they do. It would be 70–80% of their activities. And one thing I've learned over the years is that you can set up a subsidiary to make a profit, but it doesn't necessarily then go on to make a profit. And in the history of housing, there are quite a number of organisations that have set up for-profit subsidiaries that have gone on to make a loss.
Well, I do think it's as a business, it's an area where regulation is much stronger. There seems to be a growing demand for social housing. Do you foresee that as increasing the demand? Because obviously we see on the private rented sector, the anecdotal evidence is that the supply is diminishing. And in terms of social housing, is the demand for that increasing at the moment?
Oh, it certainly is. And I think if we look at what's going on in our society at the moment, in particular, poor people are becoming poorer. And I would also remind us that billionaires are getting richer. The billionaire class has increased its share of national wealth by 50% in the last 2 or 3 years. And it is a zero-sum game. So poor communities are beginning to really feel the pain at the moment. People in work are finding that they don't have enough money for food, or they're making that terrible choice between, do I feed my children or do I keep the house warm? And the demand for social housing is rising. People in work in private rented sector accommodation are finding it harder to pay the rent, and I think that we could probably let another 1 million homes of social housing if it were there, but it's not.
But it's down to some extent, isn't it, or some of the problems are down to the quality of that housing as well, and some of the older stock certainly is suffering. I mean, we've all probably seen, certainly on the ITV News and one or two other things, some of these ghastly horror stories of people who are living in very, very substandard accommodation. I mean, how prevalent is a lack of quality within the social housing sector?
Well, there's no point saying that something is unfair, but the current perceptions of social housing don't really reflect the fact that the vast majority of tenants are fairly decent, well-run, well-maintained homes. And the sorts of cases we've been seeing on the news are a small minority. Now, I'm not trying to justify, they really shouldn't exist, but they are a very small minority of all of the cases. And I can say a bit more about how those came about, if that would be interesting.
Well, I think it would be interesting, because I think people need to understand the challenges that face the sector, and we can talk about how those challenges are overcome in a minute, but it'd be interesting to hear a bit more, yes.
So I think many of the large housing associations have been formed by mergers of smaller organisations coming together. So they've had to integrate a range of legacy systems, which is hard work and doesn't always work as well as it might. So it may sound a bit hard to believe, but I think a lot of the problems that are emerging are basically to do with data integrity. They're to do with organisations not knowing what they know, if I can put it like that. So if you're a landlord with 50,000 homes and there are 10 that are in a terrible state, which might well be the case, somebody in the organisation knows that those homes need attention, but the organisation itself doesn't actually know corporately that they need attention. They've kind of slipped through the cracks because the different data systems don't talk to each other, the integration didn't work, and so on. So I think the vital thing here is for organisations to collect all the information they have from their frontline staff, from their contractors, from their tenants, listen to it, and create a database that really gives them solid information about the state of the stock. And I think the ones that we're seeing on the news are the ones that have broadly slipped through the crack.
Well, I think it'll be, what you describe will be a very familiar scenario to a lot of our regular listeners, because the same issues apply on data integrity and the ability for different systems to talk to each other. That this is a common problem, and unfortunately, as of this moment, I'm not aware of any one. I mean, what we all want is a Star Trek universal translator that you simply pop in between every single system that just translates it from one to the other. I'm amazed that no one has really looked at that. Well, I'm sure there are people who are looking at it in more detail, but I mean, certainly my experience with the social housing sector has been, how can I put it, different from the private sector, insofar as, and this is not meant in any way to be a criticism, because you've just described the challenges perhaps as, and the integration of or the merger of lots of small ones helps explain this to some extent. But what we've discovered as a business, whilst we've been doing business with the social housing sector at Vuba, is that perhaps the people in the sector, they're as worried about their jobs as anyone else, and they seem to be very target driven. They seem to be given an awful lot of sort of KPIs they have to reach, and the business seems like it's very, I don't know what the right way to describe it is, because I really don't want to denigrate it, but it sounds like they're run in a slightly old-fashioned way. They haven't yet, that they're trying to move into the next generation. And I just wonder if one had a magic wand to wave about what you might think is a way forward for the, I mean, in the absence of a Star Trek universal translator, so they can't all do this sort of data capturing yet. I'm sure that will happen at some point in the future. What do you think are the other challenges they face, and how could they be overcome?
Well, the large organisations are investing very large sums in new IT systems that will form their IT backbone. And I'm talking about tens of millions of pounds here. And those investments are beginning to pay off. I think the sector has not been well served by the software industry. There isn't an all singing, all dancing system, and people are having to create their own. But I am optimistic that this level of investment will pay off, and that the big new systems now being put in will allow a more responsive approach to tenants. I think the other point, going back to what you said, Ed, is that, I mean, when I came into housing, a very large organisation had 5,000 homes. And now a very large organisation has over 100,000 homes. But broadly speaking, it's the same people running it. It's the same, if you like, the same mindset. And what we need to do as a sector is to accept that running a very large organisation is not like running a small one, but just bigger. It's actually a different paradigm. It means different systems, different governance, different kinds of management, and a whole different approach.
Well, I can certainly understand that, and that makes sense. I mean, I think that what we haven't touched on yet is, I think, one of the other main differences between the private sector and the social sector that we've certainly discovered is that it seems to be more of a collaborative organisation. People are keen to learn from each other. In the private rented sector, if someone discovers an advantage which is going to make their business run better, they sort of want to keep it to themselves, and they want to make it their USP, their advantage. They want to keep it to their advantage. Whereas in the social sector, there seems to be a lot more, well, this really works, have you tried this?
Yes.
Would you say that's true?
Well, I think it is true. And the competition in the social housing sector comes for development funds, and perhaps to some extent for investment from banks. And there they will compete red in tooth and claw in a way that you would recognise. In terms of service provision, you have to remember that each social landlord is kind of a monopoly provider once somebody is a tenant. If you're a tenant of a housing association, it's pretty hard to say, I don't like this, I'm going to take my business to another association. So in a sense, there's no incentive to compete, which is why the regulation comes in with all the performance indicators that you've described. So yes, organisations are prepared to collaborate, and actually there was a real outbreak of collaboration during the pandemic. They all kind of surprised themselves by how much they were prepared to work together, swap policies, talk to each other about what was going on. We set up a WhatsApp group for about 250 chief executives, and I would never have thought that people would be sharing the kind of information they are sharing.
Well, yeah, that's certainly unusual in, as I say, to most of our listeners. Most people's understanding is that social housing, actually they're probably not old enough to remember this, but back in the day, before Margaret Thatcher started selling off all the council houses, that would have been what the stock was. It was owned by councils, by local authorities, and that's not the case anymore. And that provision is now being made by housing associations and social landlords. Again, a lot of our listeners will understand that the stock at the moment comes from a percentage of new development that is being done. So in other words, if, say, in our sector, Berkeley Homes are doing a development of 2,000 properties somewhere at the East End of London, there will be a percentage of those properties that are going to be used for social housing, and they will have a deal with a certain provider who will then take those properties on. Is that the future, or does the future need to be much more prescriptive, in that often with development sites it's very difficult, I would presume, for someone who's going to look forward to social provision to compete with private developers in order to win the site? So how does the future look for stock? How's it going to come?
Well, I think on the point about competition, I'll just comment on that first. If you don't have to make a profit, you're going to have more money to buy sites, if you're less driven by profit. So I do think we quite often see actually that housing associations are outbidding private developers for the acquisitions of certain sites. And when I talk to developers, they occasionally tell me stories about housing associations that paid 50% more than they should have done for property, just because they could. So I think it's more complicated than you might be suggesting. But I'd like to go back to what you were mentioning at the start about council housing. And of course, in the 1980s, many councils transferred their homes to new housing associations, the transfer associations. And there are some local authorities that still have retained stock. They haven't ceased to exist. But the balance has shifted towards housing associations. You mentioned a number of things, Ed. In terms of development, yes, at the moment, when there is a big site, developers have to create a certain amount of social housing. It's called Section 106, as you know, and that has worked reasonably well over a long period of time. But in terms of the future, it's worth saying now that in the past, you had to be not-for-profit to be a registered provider, a housing association. And a few years ago, it became possible for the for-profit sector to become involved. And we're seeing more and more of the for-profit providers, big investment companies, pension funds, putting their money into for-profit ventures. You know, I could mention, for instance, McCarthy Stone have got their own small registered provider. Plenty of others do. L&G, M&G are in that game now and are clearly in it for the long term. So the whole sector has changed. It's become much more of a mixed economy of the old not-for-profits and the newer for-profits. And they're kind of reconciling each other and getting to know each other a bit. And there is overlap, there is interchange of staff. So I think the future is about the mixed economy, and it's probably not about rigid government control, although every government has the instinct of trying to control things.
Yes, this government seems to be not really being able to work out which direction it's going in, with yet another housing minister coming and going. Anyway, that's another story entirely.
It is another story, but that's all about announcements. It's not about what happens.
Well, I think part of the problem we've always had in our sector in general is that there's never been a particularly good long-term policy. Politics gets in the way, and every 2 or 3 years they have to realise they're going to win an election, and therefore they have to sort of do what they think is popular rather than what's necessarily right for the long term, which I think makes life very difficult. Personally, I'd like to see housing taken completely out of politics and have maybe you can be the next housing czar, James. Maybe
dream
that
on.
sense. That would make sense. We'll take it on together. I'm conscious of the fact that we've probably been talking now for about 20 minutes, and I do want to understand from you where you think the future might lie. I mean, obviously, you and I first met when I, with my business hat on, came to you to look for advice in the sector and some good counsel, which I think has been very, very helpful. And as I think you know, my business provides manpower, last mile services to industry, to the property industry. What do you think the changes could be? Again, if we get back into magic wand territory, if the housing association, if social landlords and the people who manage property want to do this better, how can they do it better, do you think?
It is easy to be gloomy at the moment, to look at the growing poverty of tenants, the deprivation of communities, to think that there may be more crime, more civil disorder, much more poverty, much more fewer opportunities for people to improve their circumstances in life. I think it's important also to remain optimistic though. So we have spoken about some of the more positive trends. So I think in the future we should be looking at a mixed economy of for-profit and not-for-profit. We should be looking at a much better handle on data integrity. And I think critically we need all of these landlords to become much more aware of the needs, the aspirations, the life chances of their tenants. And there's a lot of talk about this. And there is new regulation being introduced that will increase the tenant role and increase the demands on organisations to be more responsive to the needs of tenants, which is positive. And I would comment in passing that that is simply setting the clock back to where it was when the Audit Commission was abolished some years ago. But let's not knock it. So I think there is a future in which housing associations are much more active in communities. They're tackling poverty as well as providing housing. They're working much more closely with the police, with the health service, with local authorities to create really sustainable communities. They're listening to their tenants, they're involved in the governance, they're providing really good services based on the kind of data integrity we've been alluding to. So I think it is possible to have an optimistic future, but it's not going to happen on its own.
Okay, well I think that's very positive, and I think certainly from the private rented sector, the problem that in the private residential sector, the difference or the difficulties, as I said before, is that they're not trying to stab each other on the back necessarily, but there's a dog eat dog mentality to some extent, and I think that I can see a situation where the social sector is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and because of the collaborative element, and actually it's been very encouraging hearing one or two of the things you said about some of the data integrity, some of the companies working towards producing software which actually can work. I think that sounds like it's going to be a quite exciting future. I'm well aware that you produce pretty regular updates on what you think is going on within the sector. If people do want to find out a bit more from you about where they go, can you just give the details of where they go?
Well, people should go to our website, which is www.campbelltickell.com, and we put out a monthly bulletin with all sorts of interesting articles that people can read, including one or two, I think, by you, if I remember rightly.
Well, you've been kind enough, as I said, to advise us, and I know, if I can say this, I know you're a fan of what we're doing in terms of trying to make people's knowledge of their assets and how their tenants are. Sometimes it's very difficult with staff having so many different roles. It's difficult for them to get out and about and meet tenants and just have a look at a property. And I think we all know, whether you're in the private sector or the social sector, if you don't regularly inspect a property and you don't spot a problem early and deal with it, which can be cheap, it can become a much more expensive problem down the line.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you're a housing association with 3,000 homes in one area, you've probably got a pretty good handle on all of them. But if you've got 10,000 homes spread across 20 local authority areas, there are many homes you may not have been into for 3 years, 5 years, even 10 years. So I do think that the kind of service you offer would allow landlords to make sure that they do check out their properties every once in a while and just make sure that there isn't one that is going to be the next on ITM.
No, okay. Well, look, James, thank you. I really appreciate your taking the time to talk. I really hope that's given those who are listening who don't understand the social or don't know the social sector so well something to think about. And perhaps for people who are in the sector, it's coalesced some of their thoughts around what James has just been talking about. So thank you very much indeed for taking the time. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Ed. I've enjoyed it.